remember being taken here a few years ago by an old school friend.
My name's Tim, and in 1605, this, in Ashby St Ledger, was one of the places where Guy Fawkes and Tom Wintour and Robert Catesby plotted the assassination of the king, the destruction of the government, what today we know as the Guy Fawkes plot. Guy Fawkes actually wasn't terribly important, except he was the person who knew about gunpowder. He was the person who was found, caught red-handed with 36 barrels of gunpowder under the under Parliament in a cellar. He was caught by Robert Cecil, who was one of the king's ministers and really an early version of MI5 or MI6. Brilliant man. After Guy Fawkes had been arrested, he was brought to the king's bedchamber, and the king praised his Roman resolution. He praised his determination to see through this plot. Guy Fawkes said, I wish to blow the king and all his Scottish beggars back to their native mountains. Guy Fawkes was completely unrepentant, and this is something which I find so interesting about the story. Guy Fawkes was really the first of the modern terrorists, but more than that, he was literally a suicide bomber. When he was being executed at the end of January in 1606, the other three conspirators who had been caught and were executed with him, who were hung, drawn and quartered, a very nasty, very grisly death, Thomas Winton, Ambrose Rookwood and Robert Keyes, they all died first. Guy Fawkes was the last to be killed, and he jumped off the scaffolding, hanging himself, breaking his own neck. An act of suicide. He didn't want to be hung, drawn and quartered. So there is an immediate parallel here between Guy Fawkes and, let's say, Osama bin Laden and his cohorts. At the time when we're looking at Guy Fawkes, in Catholicism, suicide was absolutely condemned. Suicide is still absolutely condemned in Islam. Indeed, there are 2 verses in the Quran which explicitly condemn suicide. It's, in fact, Islam is the only religion where suicide is condemned in the primary text. It's not condemned in the Bible explicitly. It was, of course, condemned by the popes in Catholicism, which is why Guy Fawkes was, he can't really have claimed that he was doing this for his religion, if he's so transgressing one of the primal principles that you cannot take life, even your own. Here we're coming to a church next to the building where the plotting took place. The vicar of this church once said that it seemed a little spooky early in the morning.
As well it might. Guy Fawkes was questioned and tortured by William Ward in the Great Hall and in the prisons under the White Tower of the Tower of London. 2 years later, Ward put up a memorial to Guy Fawkes.
There's an extraordinary inscription in Hebrew, and it's taken from the book of Joel, chapter 12, verse 22. What's extraordinary about it, to me, is that it's written in Latin, but it's also written in Hebrew. And the Hebrew is fascinating. It reads, Megale amukot minei koshech v'yotze la'or tzalmavet. He discovered deep things from darkness and brings to light the shadows of death. Now, there is something, I've got 3 things to add before I close. The first thing is about this first word, Magalet, and it comes in Hebrew from a wonderful word, Legolas. And I always think that this word might have inspired the great J.R.R. Tolkien. It means to discover. The second thing that I wanted to leave you with this peculiar fact. Is during the 17th century, when guys were burnt on the bonfire, people stuffed live cats into the guy so that when the guy was burning, the cat would scream. What a horrible thought. I hope Bay never hears about that. And the final thought is really about how important this event is for us in the United Kingdom. Until 1959, it was actually illegal not to celebrate Guy Fawkes, not to celebrate the 5th of November. Remember the 5th of November. And today, it's rather sad that so many people have actually forgotten what bonfire night, what the 5th of November, what Guy Fawkes means. It's so relevant for today, so relevant for an age when terrorism is round the corner. Terrorism began in 1605, in the modern era. So do remember that in the next few days as you're lighting your fireworks. This is Tim.